Welcome to the Yale Council on Southeast Asian Studies virtual brown bag series. My name is Eric Harms, and I'm the chair of the council. And it's a pleasure to be moderating today's discussion with Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz, one of our own recent PhD graduates. Before we begin, I need to just note a few minor bureaucratic and technical details. First, I just clicked the record button, so you should all know that this session is being recorded for archival purposes. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video camera. And if you truly do not wish to be identified as being a part of this session, you might also consider changing your screen name in the Zoom interface. Second, we ask that all participants keep their audio muted unless you are designated as the speaker, or if during the question and answer period, you have some questions at the end of the panel presentation. So just to note, this is being recorded, and if you're not interested in having your image on the thing, turn off your camera. So I'm really excited to welcome Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz today, because it brings back memories of an intensive Southeast Asia seminar I taught in the fall of 2013 here at Yale. Nicole was in that course, and at the time, she was then experimenting with some of the ideas that would go on to inform her dissertation research, and now this book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, which I recommend you all run out and buy right away. It's a really fantastic book. But it's really exciting reading the book because it brings back memories of that class. I distinctly remember learning so much from her at that time about her interest in Jose P. Laurel, a graduate of the Yale Law School, who went on to become the president of the Second Republic of the Philippines right after the Japanese. And Laurel learned a lot from Yale, but what was so interesting and what Nicole taught me so much about was the way in which he borrowed from the West, but he never fetishized the West. And he was much more interested in what he called Mother Asia, which was cultivated through his long-term engagement with Japan. And ever since then, I've been really impressed by the breadth of knowledge that Nicole brings to the table, not only about the Philippines, but about all of Southeast Asia. And it's a kind of breadth that recalls the capacious and comparative thinking of my colleague, Ben Kiernan, who was her advisor. It's really fascinating the first time I ever met Ben is just having conversations about history and the way he would draw in so many threads from all across the world into weaving these tales, sometimes just walking through the New Haven Green, all these stories would come together. And it's that same kind of passion for history and bringing together all these threads that I see in Nicole's work as well. And it's that breadth of thinking that has allowed her to rethink the intellectual engagements of the Philippine Revolution in ways that look to inter-Asian exchanges and a sort of Pan-Asianism that decenters the West. I'm proud to say that Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz is currently a research fellow at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge, and is executive director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation. She's truly one of our most accomplished graduates of recent years. So thank you for coming back to Yale, Nicole, to our Zoom edition of the Brown Bag series. Everyone, please join me in welcoming her, and then I'll say a word or two about the organization of today's discussion. So just take a moment to welcome Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, the way Nicole and I decided to run this particular session, given the Zoom format, we thought that rather than a kind of long extended monologue of the classical book talk style, that we would engage in a kind of conversation, a moderated discussion, a kind of question and answer, maybe a Southeast Asian studies version of the Daily Show when we have a guest who's just written a fantastic book. So I'll start that off with the first question. After I've asked a few questions, I'm sure many of you will have your own questions. And so if you start having questions, just please use the raise hand function on Zoom, or just start shouting if you can't get my attention, and feel free to interrupt, because we want this to be a dynamic conversation about what's truly a fascinating book. So let me start with the first question for you, Nicole. You talk in the book about decentering the West and refocusing attention on what you call East-East relations, and what you also call Pan-Asianism. Can you explain what led you to this approach and why you think it's important, and how you think it contributes to the field of Asian studies, Southeast Asian studies, and so on?
Yes, of course. So the late 19th and early 20th century is such a dynamic um, and important, crucial turning point, not only in global history and imperial history, but especially in Southeast Asian history. And you see throughout this period the entire map of Southeast Asia undergoing quite strong imperial consolidation and experiencing um, local resistance at the same time. And this is true across the entire map. And it also happens to be the foundational moment for Philippine history because it's the founding of the Philippine nation and the eventual nation state. And you have the first stirrings of anti-colonial nationalism in the late 19th century, as well as the creation of the first modern secular republic in all of Asia in the form of the First Philippine Republic, though it's short-lived. And it's also the transition between the old world European Spanish imperial power to the New World American colonial period, as well as the emergence of Japan um, in Asia. And yet the discussion of this foundational moment in Philippine history treats it as if it took place in a completely different part of the world entirely, without mention of Asia at all. And it sort of underscores what is a long-standing assumption within Philippine history, that the Filipino self-image is historically non-Asian, seeing itself as belonging to the Western Hemisphere. Um, and it seemed to me, frankly, impossible that the Philippines would have been divorced from all of this tumult in Asia, both Southeast Asia and East Asia at the time. And it seemed to me, frankly, Eurocentric or at best imperial to believe that this would have been the case, that it would have been so perfectly isolated from the rest. And this is an assumption that I saw reproduced outside the specifically Philippine literature and also was in the larger Southeast Asian literature. And so I wanted to interrogate this. Um, and I had, when I just started at Yale, recently read Jamil Aiden's book on the politics of anti-Westernism in Asia, and this idea about the contestation of a single Eurocentric world order um, was really, really enlightening to me. And the idea that Asia was the framework in which a lot of um, Asian nationalisms were arraying themselves against a would-be Western hegemony or European hierarchy of races was a really interesting thread to me to see and test whether that was true in the Philippines too, perhaps in the beginning, if not so much at the end. And what I found instead was that Asia becomes this sort of blank canvas upon which you can project your fantasies and fears, and it can track and index sort of prevailing paradigm shifts, and was an interesting way to look at both international vectors as well as sort of vernacular vocabularies of power that co-constituted ideas of Asia within across the sort of late 19th, early 20th century.
Thanks, Nicole. That's fascinating. You're a historian, and I know through my conversations with historians that one thing that historians love to talk about is the archives, and often these aha moments kind of emerge in the archive. And I wondered if you could share with us a moment where you sort of you decided, or you were combing through the archive, or something that jumped out and spoke to you from the archive that almost set you on this path, and towards this larger argument that you're making, and maybe describe a figure or a piece of paper that really just brought it out to you.
Um, well, a lot of my dissertation advisors are here, so they'll enjoy this. But I was told when I was first giving my dissertation prospectus that the connection between the Philippines and Pan-Asianism could be at best a chapter, but not an entire book. And so I went off to the archives, having given everyone this big dissertation prospectus about the intellectual history of the Philippine Revolution, in which Pan-Asianism was just one chapter, or Asianism and Pan-Asianism were one chapter. I didn't tell them, but I went out to prove them wrong, essentially. And when I was in the archives, I just found so much that hadn't of the sort of traditional literature, traditional sources, in which all of the references to Asia, or all of the more specific, particularized understandings of race as arising from climate and place, all these very specific things had been left aside, and that was not what was discussed in all of the sort of the traditional works on Jose Rizal or Apolinario Mabini, all the big figures in Philippine history. So I didn't even have to go that far within the archives to make my point. And I basically didn't tell my advisors what I was doing until I had written practically the whole thing. And I showed them, see, there is enough material actually to do a whole dissertation. And by then they couldn't argue with me. So what I presented as a chapter became the whole work. And I guess if you want something a little bit, sorry, if you, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
Just saying, you wanted something a bit more specific. So I can talk about one thing, which was Jose Rizal talks about how Filipinos had forgotten their own songs, their own poetry, their own place, to learn the songs and poetry of others that were not consonant with their own ways of thinking and their brought about by their climate. And that was one moment where I saw a way in which Jose Rizal and his contemporaries were theorizing race as tied to place. And it naturalized race, and then also made it inalienable from the actual archipelago, from the particular evolutionary thread there and the climate there. And I thought that showed me a way in which I could start to look at a more multidimensional understanding of what Asia meant in Philippine intellectual history, beyond merely a sort of political, social Darwinist realpolitik, transnational solidarity. I thought that there was a larger, more sort of complex grounding to Asianism than just a more narrow Pan-Asianism. Though that Pan-Asianism was also a revision to our understanding of the Philippine Revolution and Philippine history.
Thanks, Nicole. I want to continue in this thread a little bit. There's a theme about the idea of Southeast Asia in the introduction to your book, which I found really fascinating. And since this is a brown bag on Southeast Asian studies, I thought I'd ask you to pursue that a little bit and explain it to the audience. So one of the funny things that we as Southeast Asianists do is we fight for the field of Southeast Asian studies, but at the same time, we constantly tell the world that Southeast Asia is an imaginary construction of Western military and colonial imaginaries and all those things. And in the book, you remind us of that, but then you also go on to say that there's something about the Philippine Revolution that reproduced and constructed an idea of Southeast Asia and of Asianness, inspired by this sense of shared Malayness, which I found to be really fascinating. And I wondered if you could take some time to really explain that to the group, because I think it really does some important work for the field of Southeast Asian studies and how we can imagine Southeast Asia not only as a relic of Western, power politics, but also from a different vantage point.
Yeah, I worried a little bit in the beginning because I refer to Southeast Asia sort of anachronistically, because of course the concept didn't yet exist, and the historical subjects I look at never refer to one another, to their neighbors as Southeast Asians. They're fellow Malays or Asians, but more often they're referred to by their sort of colonial overlords. So it's those under British colonialism, those under French colonialism. And I employ Southeast Asia as a heuristic and conceive of it as a political construct, but I think that one of the things that we obtain by returning to sort of East-East history in this period, instead of the bilateral framework that we so often use for this period, is to see the creation of Southeast Asia as something other than merely a byproduct of the West. And you see the anti-colonial consciousness and transnational Pan-Asian thinking and engagement as a historical force that would go on to help scaffold the self-conscious region later on. So for that reason, I thought it made sense to anachronistically refer to it. Yeah.
Great. Can you explain a little bit about the idea of Malayness and how this became so central to the construction of new ideas of Philippine identity?
Yeah, it's a slippery one, I think, even for them, for at least for the illustrados that I look at. But it was one that one thing that shows first how unstable the categories of race and ethnicity were at the time, and also how they could be used to sort of buttress Asian nationalisms that were seemingly insufficient on their own. So it becomes very important to the Philippines to be counted as Malay so that they can counter the argument that they're just an anarchy of tribes and races in an archipelago left over and unmoored, not part of a larger sort of stage. And not only that, they then sort of explore Japan's Malay origin, and in being able to claim Japan as Malay, they get to ride on the coattails of Japanese power. Essentially, they're much more nonchalant toward Japanese power than, say, the Chinese are at the time, and they use their construct of the Malay race as a way to separate themselves from the Chinese and to claim the Japanese. So it's quite a malleable concept, and it's they use a lot of the sort of European folklorist and anthropological, or not anthropological, a lot of the folklore studies to basically identify shared traits, and they look at the linguistic studies, Dutch linguistic studies, as well as German, to basically say back to the Europeans, no, this is a fixed race that we are part of, and this is their entry point into a kind of universal history as they imagine it. So they can have a place within this sort of staged history. So they take a sort of ranking of races, and their answer to a racialized kind of denigration is through race itself. And in that way, they use it both positively and defensively. So it becomes a defensive kind of social Darwinist strategy, a way to be part of something larger and to buttress your otherwise localized nationalism in a larger transnational anti-colonial and racial solidarity. And it's also becomes a positive sort of act of world making. And they construct the Malay race to basically have a place within an Asian landscape where they don't have sort of ancient ruins and other things to specify their nationalism. So they look outwards.
I'm going to ask you to continue on this thread just a little bit, because I would imagine that for many of the listeners here, this extension of Malayness to Japan might come as a surprise. I think it's possible to imagine, when one looks at the geography or the cartography, the landscape of Southeast Asia, to imagine the ways in which Malay identity and linguistic connections brings the Philippines directly into that orbit. What are some of the ways in which this was being extended to Japan, and who were some of the key actors doing this kind of this racialization and expansion of the Malay world into Japan?
So the ilustrados who were part of the propaganda movement, so sort of educated elite, the ilustrados, like the national hero Jose Rizal, Mariano Ponce, who becomes the foreign emissary to Japan under the First Philippine Republic, as well as their colleagues, Isabelo de los Reyes and other ilustrados. And they sort of do things like looking at similar folk tales that and myths that the Japanese have, that the Filipinos also have, and that their neighbors do. So they're very, very, very crude um, sort of extensions and comparisons, but they try to assert, I think, of kind of fantasy of shared sort of um, race with the Japanese. And at the same time, as they try to assert this, it's on the one hand a kind of strategy to argue to the Spanish, to basically say, make good on your civilizing mission and give us the reforms we're requesting, because we have this affinity with Japan. And through the inalienability of place, it's almost inevitable that we will join up with them. And as they rise, they are a greater threat to you. So if you want to safeguard one of your final global holdings, give us the reforms we're asking for. So there's a little tongue in cheek there, but at the same time, they also think of it as a bit of a sort of dream, right? And it's like, it's an inspiration. And when you read their writings where they're claiming that the Japanese are Malay, and usually they actually just say it like that, they don't have to prove it, they just say the Japanese are Malay, they are noble Malay. They also construct Japan not as this sort of really familiar entity, but as this almost kind of like alternate future, and this alternate future, not just for the Philippines, but more globally. The way that sort of aristocratic noble titles are given up in a single breath, in a go, voluntarily. The sort of kind of discipline and self-discipline that they exhibit, they're held up as a thing apart from history, actually, and quite exceptional, and not something that are quite like in terms of kind. And so they play both games at the same time. Or maybe more accurately, they try to assert a kind of similarity, while at the same time what they actually say seems to betray that they think of Japan as something very, very different and very dissimilar from everything else.
Interesting. I want to explore this connection to Japan through one of the key examples that you use in the middle of the book. You draw this parallel between the Philippine Revolution and Vietnamese intellectuals at the turn of the century, Pham Boi Chau, Phan Chu Trinh, especially Pham Boi Chau and his travels to Japan and the Domzu movement. And I have two questions. One is, I'd like for you just to kind of explain that to the audience, right? Where you see the parallel. But the question I have for you is, to what degree is this a kind of parallel that's going through Japan, like these two parallel processes? You have the Philippines and Vietnam both experiencing this kind of engagement with Pan-Asianism. Rizal wants to create a school in Hong Kong, you know, and it's very similar to Pham Boi Chau's idea of the Domzu movement and the studying in Japan movement. A parallel that kind of has a vector through places like Japan and Hong Kong, or is there actually kind of cross conversations that are happening between people like Pham Boi Chau and Jose Rizal as well? Like, so are there movements across, or do they always go to sort of like a hub and then radiate outward? And how do you imagine that Pan-Asianism sort of working in that way?
So we don't have any records of, for example, Mariano Ponce, who is in Japan as the Philippine emissary, no records of him having any meeting with Pham Boi Chau or any of his colleagues in Japan. Though we have a very, very long record of him with Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qichao, and others. So unfortunately, we don't have that. But what we do have are sort of associations, Pan-Asianist associations in Japan, where we see that there are Vietnamese and Siamese and Filipinos and Koreans all as members. So, but we don't know the extent to which that was a fruitful engagement, how productive it was, who was speaking to whom, with what kind of regularity or depth. But we do know that that did exist. So I do see them as parallel, though they may have been more connected than we're able to see currently. One of the things that I think is different between Vietnam and the Philippines within this sort of transnationalization of Pan-Asia is that Vietnam, at least in the way that I conceive of it, which is there's the sort of the center of the Pan-Asian discourse, which is the sort of cynic center emanating out of Japan and China. And then there's the periphery. And most of the traditional literature discounts peripheral Pan-Asianism, seeing it as sort of only instrumentalizing Pan-Asianisms toward what are ultimately nationalist priorities, and so therefore discounting them as true Pan-Asianists. And I'm trying to sort of make the peripheral Pan-Asianism legible to the center, looking at different dimensions to it. But Vietnam is sort of in between the two, because it is traditionally part of the Cynic world, but it is also distinct, and it is part of Southeast Asia. So it's almost like a stepping stone. And so it's an interesting way in which you can test sort of constructions of Asia, how far they have to change and be reinterpreted in order to be transnationalized, and where that's effective and where it isn't, and through what methods. So it's an interesting comparison, and it is different, and I think the scales are different. And so for example, Vietnam doesn't have to reimagine the Japanese as Malay by looking at a folktale about a tortoise. It's very different, so I guess when you think about geographies of political affinity, which is one of the things I was doing here, there's less work there. But at the same time, I do think that Vietnam does have strong comparison to the Philippines because of the two aspects of anti-colonialism and nationalism, and the ways in which those are inflected by interpretations of social Darwinism, which then lead both to strategies of Pan-Asianism and affinities toward an idea of Asianist solidarity. But yes, I guess what I would say is that yes, there do seem to be vectors, at least from what I found in the evidence. And the vectors are mostly cities: Yokohama, Tokyo, Hong Kong, even Singapore, and others. But those are the main, Kobe, those are the main hubs.
Fascinating. Nicole, this is going to be my last question, and it's an opportunity for you to sort of make your statement to the audience a little bit about your vision about a kind of new Pan-Asian history. Clearly, in addition to the fine-grained analysis and archival work that you do in the book, it seems to me that you're making a bigger contribution. And I wondered if you might want to take a moment and kind of articulate what you see as what historians of the region should be doing these days. You could talk about the history of the Philippines or the history, Southeast Asian history. And then after that, I'm going to open it up to questions from the rest of the audience. And you can also use the question to say anything you want, really. But I'm curious about your kind of big picture vision.
Ooh, it's about 1:30 a.m. in the morning. So here in the Philippines, so I don't know how eloquent or groundbreaking this is going to be in any way, but I do think that one thing I would like to see Southeast Asianists do is to interrogate the sort of, not the construct of the region, but the sort of tangible natural reality of the region. So sort of the biotic zone that describes, the region from the Marianas Trench to the Bay of Bengal. How has that natural zone helped facilitate the trade, migration, exchange activities, and the kind of histories that I'm talking about into a self-conscious region? Yeah, that would be something that I'd like to see, that I don't have the skills to do myself. And I guess in terms of contribution of what my book is doing, during the peer review process at Columbia University Press, one peer reviewer, an excellent peer reviewer, who did so much to push my thinking to be a lot clearer and more specific conceptually, and to sort of help me follow through with a lot of my concepts in a way that I can't articulate right now at this time in the morning. But I was asked, and it annoyed me, basically, why Asia? So of course, there are histories that are beyond the kind of bilateral West with one Asian country kind of traditional histories we have. So the Philippines and the US, the Philippines and Spain, France and Indochina, etc. And they said, of course, there's a more complex world beyond that. So what? So then why Asia beyond that? And to me, to have to explain why Asia beyond that, then you would have to explain why anywhere beyond that. It seems to me important enough that I don't have to think it through even beyond that. But when pushed to do so, one thing that I thought that my history actually did bear out was and contribute was to the history of the rise of the nation state as the political form over the course of the 20th century. And I think that it's an interesting history because it shows the ways in which the social Darwinist framework of the period amongst a lot of Asian actors made a kind of internationalist, dualist kind of formal experimentation seem necessary and natural. That your nationalism should be buttressed in a larger racial grouping. And I think that racialized interpretation of the international sphere will give us a fuller understanding of modern Asia, as well as the Asia within Pan-Asianism, and the ways in which it was constituted both from and negotiated from within and without. And I think that also what you see in this history of the nation state is the ways in which it was globalized a lot in the hands of Asians, but it is not merely derivative of the Western form and the Western history, though that was also underway. You can also see through what I argue is a return to place, the ways in which the sort of Enlightenment ideals and the Western grammar for the nation could seem insufficiently specific for as grounds for anti-colonial nationalism. And so a return to sort of place as a kind of localized, movable plane to counter that very universal general plane is an entry point where you can see the more specific and particularized intellectual constructions and world making and imaginings that are underway here too, rather than merely just sort of a transfer and migration of this Western form of the nation and the nation state through Asia. So that, and Southeast Asia in general, I think, bedevils a lot of the assumptions about the history of the rise of the nation state. On the one hand, it shows, as my book does, I think, sort of the historical viability of alternatives to the nation state on some level, even if not solely, but in sort of in concert with. But at the same time, it also shows a convergence on the nation state. And so it sort of goes, it bedevils both sort of arguments, the prior argument of the literature and then the current argument of the literature. And so it's one of the reasons why I think, as ever, Southeast Asia needs to be a stronger part of the way we teach global history and research global history, because it shakes up a lot of our assumptions.
I love the way that you describe Southeast Asia as a place of constant bedeviling. Maybe we can have that become the title of an edited volume on Southeast Asian history, Bedeviling Histories or something. At this point, I'm first of all, thank you for this wonderful conversation so far. But at this point, I'm mindful that we have a broad audience. We have 50 participants here. So I'd like to open it up to any questions from those participating or listening in. So I'll give people a second to collect their thoughts. And if you want to use the raise hand function, you can do, those of you not familiar with Zoom, if you click on participants, you can find a little button to raise your hand in there. Otherwise, if that's not working, just send me a note or signal me somehow. But I see Michael Van has his hand up, and then after that, John Seidel. So we'll go with Michael first, and after the response, we'll John, and I'll keep a running list in the chat. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay. Hey, hello, Nicole, and thank you all for making this public. It's really a fabulous opportunity for those of us around the world to participate in these excellent brown bags. So much thanks. Nicole, I was wondering if you could say a few words on how social Darwinism gets to these thinkers' desks and their minds. What ways is social Darwinism mediated? What paths does it take? I've got a very Western conception of what that means. And how did it get there? And could you say a bit more about what they do with it? And again, thank you all so much.
Yeah. So one of the thinkers that a lot of the people I studied references Kropotkin, and he talks about mutual aid within a species as a sort of a tactic for survival and a necessity for survival. And this is one of the things that sort of bridges social Darwinism to Pan-Asianism, is this idea of mutual help within the species. More broadly, I would say that the way social Darwinism is originally theorized in Europe is as explaining sort of difference and inequality within a nation. But the Asian thinkers that I look at treat it as a way to explain difference between nation states within the international sphere, and see it as a much larger international amoral competition of survival. And I would say that the way that it gets to the Filipinos is through a lot of the European interlocutors that they have. The illustrators that I study end up studying in Germany and in Spain and in France. And they're very close to a couple of European academics specifically who become part of the propaganda movement. Blumentritt is one such academic, and we have streets named after him here in Manila.
Thanks, Nicole. So now we have a question from John Seidel, also Yale alumni.
Yes, indeed. Many thanks for the interesting talk. Just to say, I'm very interested in reading your book, and it was thanks to the invitation to join this talk that I heard about your book, and I've ordered it, so I haven't read it yet. So it's based on ignorance of the book and just the impressions from your talk that I actually have two questions. The first is a question about China, because in your talk, you seem to suggest that to understand the Philippines in Asia and to situate it in a decidedly non-Eurocentric way, we should take seriously, notions of Pan-Asianism that we associate with Japan, at least in the late 19th and then certainly in the 20th century. And also this, you talked about the notion of a Malay race and the, being Malay in some sense. But I guess I was struck by I'm curious whether in the book, whether there's mention of China, considering that, understandings of the rise of Indonesian nationalism now tell us how important Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, Sun Yat-sen were for the making of Indonesian nationalism, and likewise clearly for Vietnam, as was acknowledged earlier. But in the Philippine case, I wonder whether there's anything like that in a country where just look at your name and think of the Tagalog and other Philippine languages and how much they owe to Hokkien, much more than to Spanish. And there's already a kind of de-Eurocentrized account of the first globalization and Manila's role in that. But it involves China. And so I'm curious about, a country that, I think of in some ways as just a set of islands off the coast of Fujian, you know, that it's just a part of Fujian province, just as mainland Southeast Asia is just part of Guangdong province, really, at some level. So, so that's one question. The second question is, in terms of these transnational or cosmopolitan linkages, if we think of other parts of Southeast Asia, we can think of these cosmopolitan linkages that are not back to Europe and to colonial metropoles as deeply institutionalized through school systems that are either part of the Sinosphere, you know, the 4 books and the 5 classics, deeply rooted in what today we call Vietnam, or they're Islamic in what today is Indonesia and other parts of Muslim Southeast Asia. But in that kind of more sociological sense and sort of grounded in institutional terms, you know, is it that the Philippines may have thoughts and ideas and a discourse at times that links it to other parts of Asia, but institutionally, isn't it much weaker in terms of that kind of, you know, sociology, a kind of transnational, if that's the right word, a cosmopolitan set of educational institutions for the production of knowledge that just really aren't there in the same way? Or are we missing something in that regard?
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions. So first on China, I mean, you're absolutely right that a much larger history of the Philippines' location within sort of a larger Asia or Pan-Asia must include a longer history that, you know, connects the Philippines to China as, you know, as far back as the 2nd century AD at least. But in the history that I'm looking at, though there are very strong connections to Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen, and they are very key figures within the sort of Pan-Asianism in motion, especially for the figure of Mariano Ponce specifically, and they sort of hatch plans together, lend money, try to obtain arms, and try to enter into an agreement where they have they share use of arms by lending a shared location in a certain sort of storage. So there's a lot of cooperation there. And I think that at least for Mariano Ponce specifically, they are very, very formative to his understanding of the role that the Philippines is playing within a modern Asia more generally, and help him sort of feel that the Philippines is leading the torch for the Malay race, to liberate the Malay race, and that he will play this role in the same way that Sun Yat-sen will play a certain role. That said, more generally, the reason it's also an irony that most of these ilustrados are Chinese mestizos, and yet they are separating themselves from China specifically and trying to claim Japaneseness, and to separate the sort of Japanese and Chinese history, and to put Japan with Southeast Asia rather than with East Asia. It's all really a bit confused, but in a certain way, the Chinese ilustrados assimilate so, the Chinese immigrants to the Philippines assimilate so well, and the workings of place are so strong there that they become a separate group and become Filipinized. And what the Filipino ilustrados do is to sort of try to imitate the Spanish denigration of the Chinese. So they have internalized a certain kind of hierarchy for a very long time. And so in imitation of the Spanish, they try to separate themselves so they can maintain a ranking above, the same way that the Spanish do, and sort of ally themselves with a different kind of Asia. They talk about cynic vice with regard to China, and about lying and about sort of vulgarity. And then the way that they construct the Japanese version of Asia or the Malay version of Asia is very, very different. And they always, the ilustrados in the propaganda movement have lots of essays stressing the difference between the Japanese and the Chinese. As to your second question about the cosmopolitan linkages, yes, you're absolutely right. And I think what this comes to, and I will say, first of all, that I looked at what is essentially in a sort of elite version of this same history. You could take my project apart and start it over and look perhaps only at merchants, at sailors, or at the Muslim South in Mindanao and tell a different story. That is a different story from the one that I'm telling. I was concerned with the kind of really central and elite founding of the Philippine nation and the way in which that's embedded and reproduced, and the way in which those the regional and cosmopolitan Asian moorings wax and wane, but are embedded there. And I wanted to show that just from the sort of the more traditional sources without having to go all around. I think it's already there, but you could make it a much stronger by looking at these other actors. And I think the Mindanao story is especially important. The reason why I would say that there's sort of this discursive link with a weaker institutional link, I think is because of American colonization. And the American sort of colonial strategy of co-opting the elites to sort of take what was a very charged Philippine revolutionary zeal and to channel it into this sort of tutelage is very, very effective. And at the same time, as the 20th century history rewrites sort of geographies of political affinity such that it only becomes increasingly more advantageous for the Filipinos to continue to ally themselves with the US, to identify themselves in that way, to pin themselves to the dollar, to cultivate that side. And those relationships make it such that that's an investment that I think only they believe redounds to them. And it's only now that you're starting to see some stirrings in a different direction. However, I think even looking at the contemporary scene, the sort of mainstay Philippine populace does not look favorably upon that kind of reorientation away from the US when there was such a strong orientation for so very long. And as the American world power and sort of capitalistic dominance only roots itself further, the Philippines institutionally only weds itself deeper.
Thank you, Nicole. These questions and answers are so fast. I just have to say I'm learning so much right now. So thank you, everyone, for great questions and wonderful answers, too. I see that Peter Perdue has a question now. I think maybe a second round of the dissertation defense.
No, I'm not going to give Nicole a hard time this time. I mean, I've been reading the book and really enjoying it. It's fantastic to see what you've made out of it and over a long period of time. And you are in a way one of the luckiest dissertation prospectus writers, since you could take one chapter and make it into an entire book. That means you could use those other potential prospectus chapters to write more books, you see. Some people have the opposite problem, but you came across a gold mine of sources, and I'm very happy that you did. I did want to ask a question about something because it's not something I know anything about. So it's really a larger issue of the relationship between, let's say, the development of national movements out of what we might call folk traditions, or it's called folk millenarianism. The boxers in China might be one example. It's a widespread ideal that you build a national consciousness from a mass base, an agrarian base, say, or a, in Japan, there was folk anthropology and ethnography and so forth. And you cite the book by Ileto, I believe it is. Yeah, Reynaldo Ileto, where you say that he argues that the Katipunan philosophy came from the folk millenarian tradition of a Philippine society, and you say you recognize that this was a needed corrective, but this book reaffirms the intellectual relationship between the reform movement and the revolution. So could you say a little bit, about this shift away? It seems to me this is a larger shift away from a certain trend to concentrate on the folk and the peasant and the local roots of nationalism revolution toward a more global intellectual history move. Why you associate yourself with that move and what you think it offers.
Thank you for that question. Ray Leto is one of my academic heroes, and he really, I think, corrected the historiography's focus on those who were only thinking about the nation state and the elite actors who thought about sovereignty and certain ideas. And he showed the ways in which there was a mass movement that looked at the passion, the sort of the salvific narrative of Christ, and use that as a political language, and the ways in which a lot of the Katipunan rights drew on these ideas, and a lot of the poetry and songs to show the ways in which the folk consciousness sort of constituted a central heart of the Katipunan. However, in the sort of period since he published that book, which I believe was 1979, there's been a lot of revision of that understanding, which was seen as, in the beginning, maybe a little bit political, but then afterwards just not borne out by the sources. The watchwords of the Katipunan are the Enlightenment sort of mainstays of liberty and truth and freedom and equality. And they very consciously try to match the tenor of their speeches and their movement to the international tenor as a way to gain recognition and acknowledgement from the people they were fighting against, and to basically position themselves at that level, and to try to gain acceptance in that way, and to use discursive strategies that they would recognize, hopefully recognize as coming from their own. So there's been a lot of literature more recently that works against Eleto's interpretation, though he did correct some of the literature's sort of blindedness. And I would say that what I thought was important to bear out was that the revolution, which has basically been looked at in a solely domestic lens, and when it's internationalized, it's looked at in terms of sort of relationship to Europe, in terms of inspiration, or it's internationalized comparatively by looking at comparing it to basically Puerto Rico as an example for, you know, also a colony shifting from Spain to the US, and has a lot of the sort of the same kind of raw material, if you will. And I wanted to affirm that the Katipuneros thought of their revolution as international, and they cheered the rebels in Cuba, they looked at Japan, and they followed the fates of their regional neighbors. And so I wanted to restore that kind of international dimension. I also thought it was very interesting that when I looked at some of the millenarian movements from the 1880s, 1883, 1887, there were international elements embedded within those millenarian movements. And it showed me the sort of transnationalized setting in which ideas of social regeneration were occurring in the Philippines at this point. I opened the book with two sort of accounts of rumors that were spreading in the Visayas. One was this millenarian leader named Condelenes, who said that a German steamship would come to announce that Spain did not own the Visayas. And there's Dios Buhawi, or God Waterspout, who declared freedom from Spain and freed his followers from having to pay tribute. And he was supposedly able to summon rain and coins which were from America. And so there are these international elements that are at work within fantasies and rumors, and they occur even amongst these very localized rural millenarian imaginings, and are not just part of the sort of more cosmopolitan elites who travel. And it's one of the reasons why I sort of don't fetishize travel, because actually there was a lot of thinking through and world making happening locally that involved the international. And I think it's also an antidote against sort of overly binary understandings of local and global, and the ways in which a lot of the literature on anti-colonial nationalism can be sort of separated into two camps. One which looks at kind of transmission ideas transnationally and cosmopolitanism and travel, and another that looks at sort of nation and place and is seen as being more conservative. Whereas here, I think that the two are sort of co-constituted really and are entangled.
Thank you, Nicole. We have a question from Nadi Tofigian. I should also note that it's getting close to 2 a.m. in Manila, so we should allow Nicole the option to end at what is 1 p.m. for us. And if we run out of time, I'm willing to stay, but we should let Nicole decide how energy allows. And so if you have questions and are afraid that you can't get them in, please type them in the chat so Nicole has access to them. Go ahead, Nadi. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. And thanks, Nicole, both for the discussion and your book. So I'm a film historian from Stockholm University. So the issues I raise is both connected to issues raised by Eric, but also to early cinema. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this, because I think it resonates quite a lot with what you said. So on the topic of like Pan-Asianism and Japan, so according to newspaper reports from Singapore, after the screening of Russia-Japanese war films in 1905, the audience stood up and applauded after seeing the Japanese win due to like a shared sense of Asianness or anti-colonialness. I was wondering if it was anything similar in the Philippines, any similar reception or thoughts on the Russia-Japanese war. And then the second one is about this issue of shared Malayness that we also discussed in the beginning of this seminar. So the first Filipino film company was Jose Nepomuceno's Malayan Movies, formed in 1917. And I know that is after your period of time, but I was wondering, was it common in the popular imagination to use Malay in that sense in the Philippines?
Thank you for your questions. So the same moment that you relayed of sort of the Russo-Japanese war film and people standing up and cheering, we have the same kind of moments recorded in the Philippines where, you know, you have sort of university students writing about it in the papers and running out and cheering. But at the same time, actually, whereas the Russo-Japanese War was such an inspiration in Southeast Asia, actually in both French Indochina and the Philippines, it's the Sino-Japanese War, a little bit earlier, that actually was more inspiring and more stirring, and that really sort of expanded the political imaginaries. Because by the time you get to the Russo-Japanese War, you start to see Japan acting more like the Western imperial powers than necessarily the Asian savior to come. And those, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos who had been watching a little bit more closely, and I think were a little earlier on in their anti-colonial sort of nationalisms, and had more direct relationship with sort of this transnationalization of Pan-Asia, saw firsthand the ways in which Japan's geopolitical and national priorities and ambitions could lead them to collaborate with powers like France, for example, and they would extradite a lot of the Vietnamese who had come under the Zong Zhu movement to learn directly from Japan. So the timeline is a little bit different, I think, in the Philippines and in Vietnam than it is elsewhere in Southeast Asia. There's also there's some discussion in the literature about whether the Russo-Japanese War was such a big shock to Asian observers, and really maybe it was such a big shock to Western observers to see an Asian power become a modern world power, whereas actually maybe for the Thai or the Malay, it seemed a little bit more natural that a modern power would emerge in Asia that was Asian, and that maybe some of the interpretations are colored by Western observers' total shock. And then I think I can't remember now which book it was, if it was Paul Rudder, but I think he makes an argument which I don't I don't ascribe to, which is basically that it depended on the state of development of the different Southeast Asian nations politically in terms of how they interpreted the Russo-Japanese War. But I don't ascribe to that, but I just bring it up to point to some of the discussion in the literature about the interpretation. Yeah. And what might be the misinterpretation. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
You're muted, Eric.
It's double muted. Nicole, what I was going to ask is, how are you feeling energy-wise? Do you have time for one more question, or would you like to end here? There's one or two possibilities.
Yeah, I think I was feeling worse actually in the beginning, where I felt I was just sort of babbling and not making sense, and now I'm almost getting my second. So yeah, I think maybe two more questions now that I'm a little bit more coherent might.
Okay.
might
So
help around.
Yining Chang, are you still there? You had a question, and yeah, go ahead and ask your question. And then if Elisa Paredes still has a question, we'll let her ask. Otherwise, we'll stop at this. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. It's so nice to hear you talk about this in person. It's 2 a.m. here as well, so I completely sympathize. I have a question about world making and worlds and scales. So you've talked a lot about kind of the local also being the global, and from your book, what really struck me was the idea that this space that we now call Southeast Asia had a lot of different scales interacting at the same time. You've got different worlds being constructed. And that really comes through in the story that you tell. So I'm curious, what led you to ground the discussion in the world that that was grounded by this idea of Pan-Asianism, rather than all these other worlds that people were constructing, that the specific subjects that you are looking at were themselves constructing as well?
So I think there are a lot of sort of discrepant threads in the book, and for those here who know what my dissertation was like, they were much more discrepant and much more varied in the dissertation still. And I think that this construction of Asia and the idea of Asia was the way in which I was able to thread lots of different discussions and different levels and different actors. Asia allowed me to move outward from the Philippines to see sort of comparisons. As I said before, Asia was the framework in which a lot of Asian nationalism sort of arrayed their nationalism and buttressed them because of the sort of social Darwinist framework at the time that they were using. Having that as my thread and my emphasis allowed me to bring certain aspects of the discourse on civilization, on race, on place, on nation, on belonging into the fore and leave apart others. And it allowed me to connect different actors and different threads through this one central idea of the sort of creating the idea of Asia. But of course, the idea of Asia itself, once you break it down within the Philippines itself, isn't a uniform, homogeneous sort of category or space. And so then all these other scales come into play, because sometimes when they talk about Asia, they're talking about the Malays. Sometimes they're talking about Japan. Sometimes they're talking about this all of oppressed the non-West, essentially. I found that the kind of formlessness of Asia itself was one of the things that was most captivating, because it's like an index of the power structures in the region, both in terms of fantasies and fears.
Thank you, Nicole. So we'll conclude with our final question from Lisa Paredes, who is in a distinguished line of Philippine scholars that connects the both of you through the Yale program in Southeast Asian Studies. So it's a fitting way to have our final question. Go ahead, Elisa.
Thanks so much for that, Eric. It's such a pleasure to be able to join this group somewhat promiscuously. And Nicole, congratulations on this book. How wonderful. It's really a wonderful contribution to the literature, and congratulations too for being able to just like articulate everything so forcefully and so clearly at 2 o'clock in the morning where you are. That's really something. So I really think that the idea to the book is it's just so inventive, and I was thinking about, it really speaks to something that hits close to home. And I'm an anthropologist, so I think somewhat ethnographically about these things, and it reminded me of a little encounter that I had on a tuk-tuk in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And the tuk-tuk driver was asking me, where are you from? La la la. And I was like, oh, I'm from the Philippines. And he was like, oh, so we're neighbors. And then at that moment, I was just realized that I had never thought of Thailand as my neighbor. I never grew up thinking of Thailand in that way. So I think, that speaks just as much to my own kind of parochialism as it does to, I think, the kind of intellectual intuition that's at the core of the book. So needless to say, a lot of us are excited about it. I just wanted to ask, somewhat selfishly, in the spirit of Eric's question, if you have a vision for Philippine studies, if you could is there a direction in Philippine history or Philippine studies in general that you think that you would like to see? And feel free to answer it. I don't mean to make it sound like a qualifying exam question or anything like that, but to answer selfishly, if you could be just if you could decide where Philippine studies went, where would you take it? I'm so curious.
It's nice to see you, Alyssa. And thank you for that. Actually, this is a good segue to a historiographical intervention that my colleague Anthony Medrano and I are currently undertaking, which is to return the Philippines to the region of Southeast Asia from which it has been historiographically separated. So right now, we're co-editing a special issue of a journal. We haven't submitted it yet. We're still editing of sort of multidisciplinary works that look at the Philippines in this vein. And we have a great collection of essays so far, some which look at sort of transnational architecture, others that look at archaeology and linguistics, as well as sort of claims on Sabah and the perennial state of Borneo. So there are lots of ways in which you can, and there's also, I think, another article on music. So there are lots of ways you can connect the Philippines back to Southeast Asia. Oh, there's one on meteorological observatorios and sort of across the region. So yeah, there are lots of ways, and what we're trying to do is to return the Philippines to the region. So also, if you know of anyone who's working on anything within this vein, please do send me their name.
Thanks, Nicole.
Well, as the chair of the Council of Southeast Asian Studies, I want to say emphatically, welcome, but we never thought you left Southeast Asian Studies. And I do think that I would like to think that there's a bright future for the study of the Philippines at Yale. I want to call out a few of the undergraduates who are here today: Orvin Mallory, Andrea Lee, Anna Aller, and I think there's some other, I can't see all the names all at once. But there's a lot of interest among undergraduates. Greg Janey, who's in the history department in Southeast Asian Studies. And so, I hope that we can build on this momentum. And I want to thank you very much for joining us today and such a wonderful talk and conversation. So everyone, please join me in thanking Nicole, and we'll allow her to get back to the nighttime.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been like coming home, honestly. The brown bag was so formative to my thinking at Yale and was so deeply a part of this book.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.